Like to see?
Yeah. See what you're seeing.
Oh yes, that's very nice. Yeah, that gets the whole thing.
Sure does. Good. This house, we believe, was built in the 1860s, shortly after the Civil War, and we think it may be the only house still standing in Jonesborough that was built immediately after the Civil War. Probably the earliest house after the Civil War built here in town. We've reasoned that if we like the houses in black and white, maybe we would like them even more in their original colors. And so one of the projects that I have done with this house and with several other houses in town is to do a color study to find and discover the original colors of the house. And so a couple of years ago, I started taking samples of each little detail in the house, taking a section of the house at a time, and in looking at the back side of each sample of paint, we can actually see the pure color of the original paints and of any subsequent paints that have been used as the house has been painted over and over again through the decades. And so we came up with the original colors of the house being the colors that you see painted now. I think of this house as being very similar to a wedding cake because of the octagonal front and the tiered form of the house, and also many of the architectural details of the house. We have floral designs. We also have a design over the windows that looks like rain clouds with a rising sun. We have designs that look like, at least to me, rainbows. We also have a double wedding ring design built into the house. And around the top of the porch, in what we call the spandrel of the porch, we even have diamonds. One of the most intriguing things about looking at 19th century black and white pictures of buildings is to see the different shading in the different parts of the building. If you look at many of those 19th century pictures closely, you can see that the shading could not possibly be from shadows cast from the sun, but instead it is bound to represent different colors on different parts of the buildings. And looking at 19th century pictures, particularly of homes, stimulated my interest along the lines of reasoning that if we enjoyed in the 1970s and earlier the Victorian designs of buildings in black and white, why wouldn't we enjoy them even more in the original colors in which they were painted? So this got us started on learning how to investigate and determine what the original colors were. In a way, this had to do with archaeology on the surface of a building, because in order to discover the original colors, we had to dig down beneath the layers of paint that had been coated on the buildings and their various parts in successive years through the 20th century. And so the process simply meant that taking a sharp blade on a X-Acto knife, number 22 blade, and taking a sample of paint that usually was anywhere from a ½ inch to an inch square, that included a little bit of wood, and putting it carefully into a 2x2 coin envelope and labeling that envelope as to what part of the building it came from, we could then take that sample of paint along with the fragments that came with it and turn that sample of paint wood side up so that we were looking at the backs of various layers of paint. Place that under a microscope, magnify it by 19 or 20 times, and have good lights on it from 2 off-stage light sources, as we would call it in microscopy. Then we could examine the strata of the layers of the colors and determine which colors were the earliest colors, which ones had the Victorian color scheme, which ones did the original designers apply to the building in their various parts. And by going through that process and sampling every detail of every ornament of every part of the building, we were able to map out the original colors of the buildings, the original color schemes. We were able to determine how many times they had been painted with the Victorian color scheme, sometimes only once, sometimes as many as 3 times, such as the Chester Inn. And we were also able to determine how they distributed the various colors on the building. it couldn't stop just with looking at the colors. We had to actually match the colors scientifically to a system that's called the Munsell color system that was developed in the 19th century, but is still used today for light microscopy to match by natural light or by artificial light the various colors of the buildings. We could match them to specific color samples from the Munsell color system that has the colors distributed and organized in a scientific way, and that way bring back the colors that the original designers had applied to the buildings. And that's what we've done with about a dozen of the buildings here in Jonesborough. Sometimes that information has been used only to serve as a pattern for distribution of colors over a building when the building owner really did not prefer to use the original colors. Depending on the period in which the building was built, the original colors may or may not appeal to us today, but by getting the record of the original colors, then we have those for use in the future in case our own color choices and color preferences change through the years. So that's how we've gone about getting the various colors, investigating the various colors, and reapplying them to some of the buildings here in town, particularly the Victorian buildings, because the period from about the 1870s until about 1900 to 1910 was a very colorful period, and we are now enjoying adding color to buildings a great deal more than we did in the middle part of the 20th century.
Here, hold on a second. Let me actually get that.
In a very dark red.
All right, hold on. And let's go ahead and point and speak like you were.
These colors were the first three color schemes that we found on the Chester Inn. This column represents the colors that we found in the first original color scheme after the porch was installed in 1883. And to match one of the colors of gray, we had to match 50% of this color and 50% of that color. And then this is actually a very dark red for part of the trim. And then we have these two colors, 50% of this and 50% of that, for a yellow red, more predominantly yellow, for part of the building. When we got ready to paint the building a Victorian color scheme, we actually thought it would be more attractive to the modern eye to move to the second color scheme, which is this one, in which the peach color is 50% of this color and 50% of that color, with the darker red being this particular color, 50% of each of these two, and then the ceiling of the porch being this light blue. And then the third Victorian color scheme that we think probably was done in the 1890s, late 1890s most likely, was a combination of two greens. Actually 50% of this shade with 50% of that shade for one of the greens that I think of as an olive green, and then a darker green for some of the trim. And then the ceiling of the porch became darker with 50% of each of these two colors for the ceiling of the porch. When I first began to look at the colors on the inn, and as I developed a realization and understanding of these first three color schemes, I was looking through my microscope by myself one day and just began to chuckle when I realized that the building was all green, two different shades of green, because at that time the name of the business was the Planter's House. After sampling each detail of the building, we then had to apply the proper colors to individual details so that the painters could see how to paint the building out. And so this is the second color scheme with the labels applied to the black and white photograph, keeping in mind that before we painted the building its present color scheme, its Victorian color scheme, it was painted all white. And as we turn through these pages, we can see how the color scheme was applied based on our microscopic analysis of paint samples that we took of each detail each little facet of each detail of the building, and then painted the building these new, for us, wonderful Victorian colors that matched the original color scheme, at least the second color scheme, that we think was applied sometime in the late 1880s. The gray section of the Chester Inn to your right was the kitchen building. It and the east end of the inn itself, closest to us in this view, were built in 1798. The kitchen building then had the addition of the present dining building behind it in 1836, and the west end of the inn, beyond view from here, was added in 1836. Then in the 1890s, the dining building had its second floor added, and the two buildings, the kitchen building and the dining building, were connected. But the interesting result of the paint analysis story was that we found that the entire exterior, including the siding and all of the brackets along the roof line and the present-day windows, were all added in 1883 in a major remodeling project when the porch was added. Jonesborough is historically authentic in that it's the place where genuine history occurred. And many of the buildings are physical.
Genuine history, that's
yeah,
an interesting term.
Well, I mean, instead of history being remade or fictionalized or partially fictionalized, it's the place where history really occurred. And we still have those stories, many of them very accurately, we believe, written, and we're not having to fill in a lot of details out of our imaginations. And these buildings represent physical links with that history. And we're not having, we want to resist as much as we can using our imaginations to fill in the details of the historic buildings, just as we resist using our imaginations to fill in some of the gaps in the stories of the history. And that's one of the major reasons for wanting the town to be as authentic as we can make it, along with the authentic history, so that it's not made up, it's not contrived to the greatest extent that we can avoid any kind of a contrivance. When people come into town, they just really thoroughly enjoy being here and fall in love with the town. And for us, it's really wonderful because we also enjoy living here. One of the things that we do in our tourism development too is that we consciously try to make sure that anything we do for the tourists, for the traveler, should also be good for the people who live here. And then people who come here identify with living here, and they have a vicarious experience as though they were able to live here. And I think that's why they love the town. So we're very conscious of that. We don't want to make it into a tourist destination in the sense that everything about it is designed specifically to draw tourists or to encourage tourists to spend money. We want tourists to come and have a genuine experience that is really meaningful to them and share the experience with us who live in town. And then as a side benefit, go ahead and spend money, which we need.
Thank you so much.
Well, you're welcome.
Thank you for being here at this time. It was just
I'm glad to
perfect.
have met you. A pleasure to meet you.